Bonjour à tous and welcome to this video about liaison in French. Now liaison is a really big topic and it's not something that I ever learnt all in one go. I picked it up as I went along and I think that is the best way to learn this. So although I am going to give you all of the information you need, I don't recommend that you try to memorize all of this video in one go. Instead, use it as a reference and come back to it when you need it. I also think that the advice that I'm going to give you in this video is more important than the information about liaison itself. At the end of the day, you don't need me to tell you when to liaise and when not to. You can quite easily Google that. That information is readily available online. However, I am going to give you some advice that the rest of the internet might not give you, so please do stick around for that. First though, we need to answer the question, what is liaison? So let's start with one of the most basic principles in French pronunciation, and that is that the final consonant in most words is silent. So for example, take the word vous. It is spelt V-O-U-S, but we don't pronounce the S at the end. And yes, this is what makes French uniquely difficult amongst the Romance languages. We don't have this problem in Portuguese, Spanish or Italian, but hey, what's French without a little bit of quirky pronunciation? Our second principle is that when a word is followed by a vowel sound, the final consonant in that word is usually pronounced. That is liaison. So for example, we don't say vous êtes, instead we say vous êtes. So suddenly we're pronouncing this S, albeit as a Z sound, vous êtes. However, be aware that the liaise sound is pronounced at the start of the first syllable in the following word. Essentially, that S moves over. So we don't say vous êtes, instead we say vous êtes. Now in fast speech, of course, you can't really tell because the words are kind of squished together. But you will find that when native speakers put a pause between the two words, they syllabify it vous êtes and not vous êtes. We then have a few rules that go along with this. So for example, S and X, when they liaise, become Z. So for example, trois hommes and faux amis. D is pronounced more like a T when it's liaised. So for example, quand est-ce que tu reviens? Quand est-ce que tu reviens? And grand-oncle. And F is pronounced more like a V. Now, as it happens, there's only one example of this, and that is the word neuf, which either means 9 or new, but in both cases, the F sound becomes a V. So for example, 9 ans, meaning 9 years. P is only liaised with the words trop and beaucoup. So there are other words that end with P, but it's only with these two that you can liaise it. So for example, we would say il est trop âgé, he is too old. J'ai beaucoup appris, I have learnt a lot. But in the expression un coup en traître, which means a betrayal, you don't say un coup en traître. Instead, it's just un coup en traître. And finally, nasal vowels become oral vowels when they're liaised. So basically, if you have a nasal vowel, when it's liaised, it becomes an N or an M. So for example, un bon ami and mon enfant. So as I said before, I have some advice when it comes to liaison, and I really think this is more important than the information itself. So if you're not going to watch this whole video, that's fine, but please pay attention to this part. So piece of advice number 1 is to learn as you go. As I said before, I didn't learn these all in one, and it's really not worth thinking about all the time. I don't want you to get to the end of this video and then feel really overconscious of your pronunciation. It really isn't a big issue, and instead let yourself make the mistakes, right? I learned all of this by making mistakes and learning from them. That is absolutely fine. Piece of advice number 2 is to listen to the way that native speakers speak. So often when people listen to a foreign language. They listen just to understand, and that's okay, but my advice is to listen to learn as well. So if you hear a native speaker use liaison when you didn't expect it, make a mental note of it. I'll give you an example from my own experience. When I lived in France, I noticed that my colleagues said petit à petit. Up until that point, I'd been saying petit à petit. And when I asked them, do I need to liaise the T of petit? They said, yeah, it sounds kind of weird if you say petit à petit. So I made a mental note, made sure that when I said it, I said petit à petit. And now, to me, petit à petit feels a little bit weird. So I learnt that not by being taught, but by noticing how other people were speaking and applying it to my own French. And finally, if you're listening to someone speak and you think you've heard a word that you don't know, consider the possibility that it's in fact a word you do know hidden behind a liaison. So I'll give you another example here. I once heard someone say, c'est trop amer, c'est trop amer. And I thought I'd heard c'est trop and then this new word, pas mer. So I went straight to the dictionary and looked up a word beginning with P. And I tried loads of different spellings. I tried P-A-M-E-R, P-A-M-E-R-E, P-A-M-A-I-R-E, and alas, found nothing. And then it occurred to me that the word before this mystery word was trop, which, as we've seen, ends with a P, and that P can be liaised. So I thought, maybe what I'm hearing is the word amer, not pas mer, and I happen to know that amer meant bitter, and suddenly it all made sense. They were saying that something was too bitter. Now, I don't suggest that you do this with every single new word that you hear, because sometimes you might just be hearing a word you've never heard before, but sometimes it is possible. So if you're really struggling, do think to yourself, what word comes before, and is it possible that there's a liaised consonant there? So now let's move on to the liaisons themselves. Now there are three types of liaison in French: obligatoire, interdite, and facultative. So obligatoire, as you can imagine, means obligatory, interdite means prohibited, and facultative means optional. And we're going to go through each of these one by one, starting with the most important, and they are liaison obligatoire. Now, as far as I'm concerned, the best rule of thumb for liaison is to assume that you can in all cases. It's not right all the time, but in most of what we say, liaison is obligatory. French really doesn't like putting two vowels together. So if you think you can, give it a go. Sometimes you'll be wrong, but that's okay. So if you have a determiner followed by a noun, you must liaise. If you don't already know, a determiner is a word like a, an, the, some, and also numbers. So for example, un enfant, les enfants, deux enfants, quels enfants. All of these must use liaison. The same goes for determiners plus adjectives. So for example, un étrange pays, les énormes bâtiments, and un intéressant projet. And if you have a noun then followed by an adjective, liaison is also obligatory. De bons amis, un gros animal, and un grand homme. Moving on to a few more, we have pronoun plus verb or pronoun plus pronoun. So most sentences start with a pronoun and then a verb. So this is what I was saying before. Most of the time, liaison is obligatory. So for example, vous avez quel âge? Peut-on y aller? And tout est possible. If you have a monosyllabic preposition, so that's a preposition made of one syllable, you must also liaise it with the following word. So dans une maison, sans aucune idée, and chez eux. And if you have an adverb followed by an adjective, you must also liaise. So for example, très heureux, bien intéressant, and moins agréable. Finally, there are also some set expressions where you just have to liaise because. So for example, tout à coup, I spoke to you before about petit à petit, and c'est-à-dire all require liaison just because they do. We then move on to les liaisons interdites, the prohibited liaisons, and as I said, I think it's more useful to learn the exceptions to the rule than the rule itself. So naturally, you do not liaise between punctuation. So if you have a very deliberate pause between two words, then you don't liaise. So for example, nous, eux et vous. Liaison is also not allowed after the word et, meaning and. So, for example, this sentence reads un homme et une femme, not un homme est une femme. And that's because liaison with est, the third person singular of être, is obligatory. And so if you pronounce this est une femme, what you're saying is a man is a woman, not a man and a woman. So et, meaning and, never liaises. And you can't liaise after a single noun either. So for example, we would say le chat est sorti. We also don't liaise before the y sound. Now I think as English speakers, we treat y as more of a consonant anyway, so you might not be tempted to liaise with it. But y is technically a semi-vowel, and so speakers of some languages might regard it as more of a vowel. The other thing with this sound as well is that it only really appears in foreign words in French anyway, so for example, un yacht and des yaourts. You can't liaise before oui, un when it means one rather than a or an, huit and onze. I'm not entirely sure why, but that is simply the case. For example, mais oui and ce sont huit, not ce sont huit. And after the plural s in some compound words. So compound words are words that are made up of two existing words, and often to make these plural, instead of putting the s at the very end of the word, you put it at the end of the first word of the compound. And in these cases you don't liaise the s. So for example, les arcs-en-ciel, the rainbows, you don't liaise that s with the e of en. And les vers à soie is silkworms, and you don't liaise the s with a. Whenever the to form of a verb ends with an s, it does not liaise, regardless of what tense or mood it is in. So for example, tu aimes aller en France, and il faut que tu partes en vacances. So in the first sentence here we have the simple present, and in the second sentence we have the present subjunctive, but in both cases it's a to form of a verb which ends with an s, and so neither s liaises with the following vowel. And finally, you never liaise before an h aspiré. So for example, you'd say des hamsters, not des hamsters. Les harkis. Harkis is a group of people in Algeria that fought for the French back in the day. And le hockey. So you might already know about the h aspiré as the one where you can't put an apostrophe between le and the noun. In any case, you can't liaise with these at all. They are relatively rare words, I will admit, but if we're talking about liaison, you need to know that you cannot do it here. And finally, we move on to liaison facultative, the optional ones. Now, of course, because they're optional, it doesn't really matter if you do them or not. Really, it is just a matter of personal taste. However, you should know that more optional liaison is generally regarded as more formal. So if you want to speak more formally, you're more likely to use liaisons where in regular speech you might not. So do be aware of that. If you do these a lot, you probably do sound a little bit more formal, but let's face it, it's better to sound more formal than you need to be than less formal than you need to be. So let's have a look at some of the situations where we can use these. If you have a plural s, you can choose whether to pronounce it or not. So for example, we can say des chansons entraînantes or des chansons entraînantes, and les personnes en question or les personnes en question. For me, all of these sound pretty natural. I don't think I have a preference for either one, and it really just depends how I'm feeling at the time and perhaps even the words that I'm using. If you have avoir or être followed by a past participle, you can choose whether to pronounce the word final consonant. So for example, nous avons aimé notre voyage, or nous avons aimé notre voyage, and vous êtes arrivé en retard, or vous êtes arrivé en retard. For me, these are a little bit less natural. I'm less likely to liaise in casual speech here. Certainly, nous avons aimé notre voyage to me feels more natural than vous êtes arrivé en retard. So I think, for me, I'm more likely to liaise avoir than I am être. But I think in everyday speech, I wouldn't liaise them at all. I'd say nous avons aimé and vous êtes arrivé. And then after ER infinitive, so for example, you can say je veux aller ailleurs or je veux aller ailleurs. Now for me, liaison here feels very, very unnatural, and it's not something you hear very often from native speakers either. I did hear this once in some relatively formal recordings, and it sounded really weird. I even questioned it, and I was informed that indeed doing liaison here just sounds more formal. So I wouldn't advise doing this in everyday speech. It isn't wrong, but it is a little bit odd. We can choose to do liaison after the words quand, mais, soit, and dont. So for example, quand il était là or quand il était là, mais elle veut partir or mais elle veut partir, and ce dont il discutait hier or ce dont il discutait hier. For me, generally, these sound more natural with liaison. Certainly with quand il était là is much more comfortable than quand il était là. With mais, again, it kind of depends on how I'm feeling. Mais elle veut partir, that sounds pretty good, but mais elle veut partir sounds fine as well. And then finally, if you have an adverb that ends with ment followed by an adjective, you can decide or not whether you want to liaise the T. So for example, il est extrêmement agréable or il est extrêmement agréable. Again, I could do both. I think in this case I probably wouldn't, but it doesn't really sound wrong either way. So there we have pretty much everything you need to know about liaison in French. As it happens, there is actually another type of liaison called fausse liaison, which, as you can imagine, means false liaison. And this is basically where people add letters that don't exist. And it is technically wrong, so I'm not going to go into it in much detail. It happens a lot with numbers, I think because numbers feel plural even if they don't actually end with an S. So for example, I've heard people say il a 4 enfants. So the word quatre doesn't end with an S, but because, of course, it means 4, it feels plural, and it's not all that unnatural to say 4 enfants. But as I said, it is wrong, and so I don't want to teach it to you, because then you might develop some bad habits. However, if you do want to know a little bit more about that, I've put a link in the description to a website that explains the different types of false liaison, because it is quite interesting, but I don't want to model bad language, so have a read of it, just try not to start doing it yourself, because it is, as I said, incorrect. As always, if there's anything that is unclear, please do not be afraid to ask. Thank you very much for watching this video, and until next time, à bientôt.